thank you. I really enjoyed both, should I say, 2/3 papers. Okay. Yeah. And thank you for providing, two papers that provide both finely grained and reading against the grain perspectives into the complexities of cultural and artistic intersection, which is as much about cutting through to divide spaces as it is about the creation of shared spaces. The papers also deftly explore the complexities of interpretation of artistic practice from India and Pakistan stroke Bangladesh in 1950s and 60s London. Of course, in the case of Dayanitha Singh, this extends into the 21st century. I hope you don't mind, but I will respond to the two papers together because although very distinctive, they also, unsurprisingly, have a number of really interesting commonalities. They are about the excavation of memory that is often fugitive and sometimes unreliable. They are about multi-layered status relating to individuals, objects, and actually a hierarchy of nations. They are about identity and place, their rootedness, yet elusive fluidity. The excavation of memory is a really interesting exercise. In the case of journeying through modernism, the trail left by Aberdeen and Sultan is far more fragile in comparison with the two exhibitions relating to Nehru, both of which, that's not surprising, both of which were cited in the South Bank in the Royal Festival Hall and Hayward Gallery, as already said. The excavation of memory by Sanyukta and Lotte is quite forensic, particularly in the case of Sultan, since records of his visit to London and his exhibition history are more tenuous than that of Aberdeen. The latter has left a much firmer footprint, and yet even here the details are sketchy, as pointed out in the paper. And in this country, he was until recently a largely forgotten artist, like so many of his contemporaries from the subcontinent. The treachery of memory, especially memory that is not embedded as part of a master narrative, was starkly demonstrated in Rashid Arain's, yes, I know, many, many references, historic exhibition, The Other Story in 1989. A large number of the artists exhibited were from earlier generations and had enjoyed considerable success in Britain in the 50s and 60s. Works by artists like F.N. Souza and Avinash Chandra, for instance, had been acquired by both public and private collections. However, these were fragmentary flowerings, and by the 1980s, they had almost been completely erased from the mainstream consciousness and were reportedly unknown to a large number of young Black artists who had begun their practice in this decade. The elusiveness of defining and fixing memory is highlighted by both the exhibitions relating to Nehru, but in very different ways. The 1965 exhibition is replete with visual aid memoirs, the history walls and timelines, for example. They also play a key role, I think, in directing memory with what appears to be an authoritative and impregnable detailing of neatly chaptered chronologies. This is reinforced by the fact that this is now a permanent exhibit in Delhi. Memory in Dayanitha Singh's exhibition, Go Away Closer, however, is a much more elliptical process, less about Nehru, more about archival interventions, and redefining that supposed bastion of memory, the traditional museum, the museum as mobile home and house museum, as Holly so eloquently analyzes in her paper. Status. This might sound like an odd thing to discuss, but the question of status, with all its ramifications, leapt out at me from both papers. There is a marked difference, for instance, in status in the exhibitions relating to Nehru and the exhibitions in Aberdeen and Sultan, again not surprising. But Aberdeen was already a prominent artist in India before partition, as well as in East Pakistan before it became Bangladesh. He's viewed as the founding father of modern art in Bangladesh and is reverently referred to as Shilpa Acharya, or great teacher of the arts. His London exhibitions had state patronage, and yet it is clear that the infrastructure that supported it was somewhat amateur, to say the least, and dictated the size of the works that he brought with him. As an aside, it reminded me of Balraj Khanna in 1964, the artist Balraj Khanna, who, on a very flimsy invitation from a Mayfair gallery, carried this 8-foot by 4-foot, he didn't have the money to transport it, hardboard painting, along with a hapless friend who helped him. They took it there. It wasn't looked at. The galleries didn't even bother to give him 5 minutes. And then they started trudging back to Golders Green. And as he says, under the menace of this weight, they just chucked it into the Grand Union Canal. Anyway, so Aberdeen was clearly very wise to select only smaller works. But even here, there are gradations. Sultan's status was far more precarious than that of Aberdeen. He was a good few years younger, of course, when he first visited London. And yet, this is a story that really appeals to me. There is a gallantry and egalitarianism about the way he went about exhibiting his work. He participated in open-air exhibitions for Sunday artists. I mean, that is such a, for all professional artists, that is really a demeaning term. But he went, he did it, he had the courage to do that. And he must have sold some paintings to fund the lifestyle of his bohemian filmmaker friends. So, I think there is something there. And he also got selected on pure merit for a somewhat more prestigious show, I mean, still, at the Leicester Galleries. So I think he shows a lot of gumption. Nehru as a world figure is perhaps not the best comparator when it comes to discussing unequal status. It does, however, reflect the realpolitik of that period. The Nehru exhibitions are in flagship spaces in the South Bank. The 1965 exhibition in particular has all the panoply and pomp of state patronage at its most exalted. It is sumptuous with weighty names. Nehru himself as the principal, albeit posthumous protagonist, the Queen, Prime Ministers Harold Wilson and Indira Gandhi. Oh, she wasn't Prime Minister in 65 yet, never mind. The megatour and the consequent enshrining or mummification, I haven't seen it, so you might challenge me about that, whichever way you look at it in New Delhi. In the case of Dianita's Go Away Closer, what is being explored in addition to human relationships is the status of ordinary objects. And the status is not necessarily conferred by its association with a great political leader. Instead, it is an excavation of the biography of the object. The closest comparison I can find, and it is a very inexact one, so just ask the questions of the three girls, not me, is curatorial rather than artistic. Perhaps Neil MacGregor's The History of the World Through 1,000 Objects being the most celebrated version of this, affording us, as it does, a multiplicity of perspectives. Approaches such as these, to me, recall what the cultural historian Bakhtin refers to as polyvocality, where master narratives are challenged and problematized by narratives from below and from the margins. However, we might also wish to interrogate the interlocutors who are conferring the status. Dianita, Sunil Kulnani by implication, and by virtue of association with the objects, perhaps Nehru himself, are very much part of an artistic, academic, and political elite. This is a fundamental question, however, that relates not just to them, but to all museum collections, their contextualization, deconstruction, and interpretation. Dianita's exhibition also demonstrates a broader point. This has been made before. How the status has changed, not just for Indian artists, but for Pakistani and Bangladeshi artists as well, as reflected in the recent descent of British curators on the Dhaka Biennale. It is true to say, however, that until the 1990s, even the modest exposure given to artists from the subcontinent tended to focus on India rather than Pakistan and Bangladesh. When Salima Hashmi and I curated An Intelligent Rebellion, Women Artists of Pakistan in 1994, contemporary Pakistani art had hardly any profile in this country. This has, of course, changed. Globalization has also resulted in the blurring between artists practicing in the subcontinent and artists of the diaspora living in this country, by no means more privileged by doing so, as Al-Nur Mitta, trained in India but practicing in England, never tires of reminding me. Oh, my colleagues in Baroda, they're doing so much. Sorry, Al-Nur. We seem to have traveled a considerable distance since the 1950s, but considering the long gaps, the false dawn, particularly of the 60s and perhaps of the 80s, we should never lull ourselves into a false sense of security. Now, identity and nationhood are explicit or implicit in the exhibitions discussed. In the case of Aberdeen and Sultan, their nationalities change not once but twice, from Indian to East Pakistani to Bangladeshi, through cataclysmic processes that had resulted in much bloodshed. it might be worth exploring the impact of the changes in nationality on these two artists. Samyukta and Lotte have described their later artistic practice as unesteemed by their peers. Now, that's such a loaded and charged and powerful word. Aberdeen, whose fame had been consolidated through the 1943 famine paintings that you saw, after his London visit, increasingly immersed himself in a folk idiom in the face of considerable criticism. Sultan goes one better. He retreats to his birthplace of Narail, eschews modern technology, reportedly only visiting Dhaka after the formation of Bangladesh, and creates works that are a defiant celebration of rural life. Almost 2 decades earlier, a fellow Bengali artist, Jamini Roy, now cue regulatory reference to Geeta Kapoor, because I did really, the catalogue, I know you dismiss it now when I mention it, but that had such an impact on me in terms of how you had written about Jamini Roy. So you've got to face it, Geeta, you're going to become a constant reference point, increasingly so. So anyway, Jamini Roy had undertaken a very conscious and what must have been a difficult quest for an artistic idiom that was distinctively his and not derived solely from his academic Eurocentric training. His works were informed, you all know this, by the rich and varied visual culture of Bengal, of which, of course, he was a powerful interpreter. The parallels between Aberdeen and Sultan and their fellow Bangladeshi artists with Jamini Roy are many and inescapable. The interest in the Patau or scroll tradition of painting and the preoccupation with rural and tribal cultures indicate a stubborn clinging to a Bengali identity that seems to transcend national boundaries, because Jamini Roy, of course, was on the other side of the divide in India. Interestingly enough, Aberdeen, who, as the paper points out, was activist and pedagogue as well as an artist, did play a crucial role in the shaping of Bangladeshi identity, not least because of his role in the language movement that led to the formation of Bangladesh. Dayanita Singh, on the other hand, and there's a big gap, of course, in terms of years, through the various phases of a remarkable artistic practice, which ranges from being one of the most important chroniclers of urban middle-class India to a constant and restless experimentation with and challenge of her own practice, is firmly both transnational and translocal. Just 2 paragraphs more. From the 1950s to this day, if we accept, because London does seem to be a locus point, if we accept London as an influential nexus, the paths artists have traveled have not been easy, smooth, or straightforward. But there is growing acceptance of nuance, multiple identities, complexity, complication, hybrid practice, and self-definition by artists. Transdisciplinary innovations, the breaching of disciplinary boundaries, and the worldwide flow of people, merchandise, finance, and ideas transcend national boundaries. Now that London, in many ways, I can't believe I say this, I normally talk about the North, never focus on London. Now that London, in ways I had never imagined even a week ago, is becoming a contested space in the wake of the referendum, these 2 papers implicitly raise other questions. Will the cultural axis begin to shift irrevocably? Will there be a loss of faith in the city, which has always seemed to be the epitome of confidence and resilience, 2 world wars notwithstanding? London has opened its arms to different forms of art practice, perhaps belatedly, from all around the world, since the artistic traditions they have emerged from are now part of London's own artistic traditions as well, by virtue of its transnational communities. In a very uncertain future, maybe this will be its salvation. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Nima, for a very rich and thoughtful response. In the interest of time, what I'm going to request people to do is to speak into the mic that Ella is going to pass around so that everyone can hear your question. And I'm going to pool 2 or 3 questions for the panel before we take responses. We have 20 minutes. So questions. Car.
So I have one for Holly and one for Lotte. And sorry. The one for Holly is about what comment you might have about Dayanita's furniture armatures for her museum things, and their relationship to modernist furniture design, because they're really redolent of that kind of simple but very rich sort of furniture. And then the second is that for the last Dhaka Art Summit, Sultan ended up in Ann Arbor, and so I got an email that was like, do you know anything about Sultan in Ann Arbor? And of course I didn't, but I got to listen in on the incredible informality of that tour. And so I'm not sure that the opposition that you make between the formal US tour and the informal bohemian sort of London holds up. And in fact, I think the informality of that tour is actually a lot like Aberdeen's sort of, it looks heroic, but actually it wasn't type of thing. And so I just wanted to sort of trouble that distinction.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions before we move to the responses. Other questions, comments? Okay, Hamad. Let's get Hamad in.
Thank you for both those wonderful papers and the response. I had really a comment and an observation. I thought the Sunday painting sort of framework that you outlined was very rich and can be taken forward also to take into account more recent exhibitions and recent practices. I can think instantly of the Pakistani artist Tasadduq Sohail, who would actually show his paintings on the side of Hyde Park, and he did that until about for several decades. And then when the Serpentine in the Indian Highway show, there was kind of a railing constructed around the Serpentine Gallery, which displayed M.F. Hussain. And Adrian Searle's review was actually quite scathing in the sense of saying, oh, well, you don't need to construct a railing. There's already one on Hyde Park. And I thought that might be quite interesting as just a sort of comparative frame over time to look at this.
All right, if there's not one more question, then we'll move to responses, but I'll give the audience just a minute or two to think. Okay, actually, Shreya has a question, and then we'll move to responses.
This is not really a question, it's an unformed thought for Holly, that I kept thinking through your presentation about the archive, and also sort of, because we were looking at Dayanita Singh's photographs of files, and sort of also, was it the archaeological survey that she'd taken a picture of as well? And to think in some ways of the archive in the museum, but also the museum as an archive. But what happens to bureaucracy, or where I think in some ways it seemed like it was something that we were thinking about and looking at, but how far can we unpick sort of bureaucratic forms and politics through these museumization processes as well? This is very vague, I'm sorry.
So let's go to our speakers, and then I see Sharmini. Do you have a question? Actually, oh, I'm so sorry, Geeta. I didn't realize that your hand was up, but let's take Geeta's comment and Sharmini's comment.
It's a query which is not. I'm not sure of the answer that I would give to such a query, but to Holly, your actual unraveling or the actual exposition was fascinating, but I'm not very sure of the premise of the proposition that you make, which to me, between the Nehru exhibition and the Dayanita museums, the asymmetry of the two propositions seems to me to be a problem which you don't actually address. You do for each of them, and in relationship to each other, you make several very subtle points. But I still, at the end of it, didn't know whether methodologically this is a valid thing to do, which is, what is this? Do you need a greater inquiry into the asymmetry of the two exhibitions. And as an aside to that, I would say that the fact that there is a museum design, the exhibition design, it also relates to what Karen was saying, that there's an exhibition design. One was in, Eames and NID, and now this is Dayanita, who's a student from the NID, more or less recalling her background in design from NID. I think that the attempt by Dayanita to create these frames are too much like, and I would agree with Karen, and I've said that to Dayanita, they're too much like screened furniture. And so I don't think they actually present themselves as exhibition design. And neither as installation nor as exhibition design. So I'm suggesting that we inquire into the asymmetries as well, both of the figures, the status, as well as the proposition in exhibition terms.
Thank you for that. So we'll take one last comment by Sharmini, and then we will go to the speakers.
Thank you. This is just a small comment, and it, I think, dovetails a little with what Geeta's just said, but what occurred to me, and sorry, this is for you, Holly, is that when you, and I may have missed this if you've talked about it in the presentation, but you were juxtaposing two exhibitions or two presentations of work, and I didn't feel that you addressed what to me was very obvious perhaps to address, and why you didn't address it, but Nehruvian politics next to Dayanita Singh, who from my conversations with Dayanita, and I think perhaps what is also being expressed quite vocally by her, is her huge opposition to India-centric national surveys. And I feel that maybe you did address it and I missed it, but I think that that was something that really seemed to be amiss there.
Okay. All right. I think we have lots to work with. I hope, are we going to share 2 mics, or is that one mic going to pass? Okay.
Let me see where to start. I might take one and then move on. So I'll start with Sharmini's comment. And I will say that this was a short talk, so I couldn't talk about everything. I was looking at Dayanita's show through the Nehru show. So Dayanita's oeuvre is much vaster and much more complex, I should say. And I was kind of using, and this was a personal choice as a writer, and we can also, I'd actually love to discuss this, thinking about how to talk about exhibitions and even about contemporary art, which is something that I'm thinking a lot about, is kind of what, as a writer, can I offer? And in this case, I was interested in the resonances between these two works, and there are many asymmetries, and I completely agree with that. But to the point about Nehruvian politics, I was with, I will in the future perhaps make that clearer, but I was hoping to express, was a show about Nehru, and then how Dayanita pushes back against borders and boundaries. And that was the hope with the exposition and discussing Museum of Chance, and that movement of switching across many countries at that time, and also trying to evoke multiple languages, trying to evoke kind of ideas that are not boundary laden. But I do, and I stand by this, that I think that there is something provocative about her exploration of Nehru, and that there are those threads through her work. And I think there are provocations to be made about that. Maybe I'll switch to you.
All right, Karen, great that you're following the Ann Arbor thing. I think that's wonderful. I mean, I've not been in a position to do so, but
Yeah, there was just a tiny
fragment. There's a fragment, and a fragment is enough for an anthropologist, no? So, I mean, it's interesting because they've just done a big exhibition of Mahbub and Lipi's work, so there's an Ann Arbor connection here, and the idea of something that looks heroic from the outside is all about the ways in which this becomes re-scripted subsequently, and I think Hamad's suggestion about following up how these various types of contexts produce value and how these have been used and played with by artists, I think is really important, and to look at these other antecedents and things that follow it. I think what is interesting in Sultan is that he didn't care about status at all. I mean, what he did in the US and what he did in London was exactly what he did in South Asia, which was basically roam around, paint some stuff, sell some stuff, and then, you know, live the village life. I mean, that was what he wanted to do, and that's what he always did. But that makes it really difficult subsequently to reclaim within a context of value, and therefore distinction, and therefore scholarship, these types of artists. And I think what's happening with the history of Pakistani art, specifically in the Eastern Wing and contemporary Bangladesh, is that without spaces of distinction, scholarship is increasingly complicated because of this evanescent archival trace, but also because of the lack of interest. And perhaps now, with the infusion of money into the Bangladesh art scene, this might create structural conditions under which there are all sorts of new implications for scholars, both in terms of being propelled towards reclaiming an archive or searching out that archive, but also other types of interest in terms of writing or discussing some of these figures.
Sanjukta, do you want to respond? We have actually time for at least one response and perhaps a mini round of comments and questions before we're out.
I can just talk about the contemporary interest in Bangladesh. Is this on? I'm loud enough. Yeah.
Speak into
So when I went to Dhaka for research, and I could already sense this interest in Bangladesh. Some of the current art collections in India, the Delhi Art Gallery, for instance, created an industry out of Bengal, ignored for such a long time, and brought the artworks to Delhi in a particular kind of 1990s art market informed circuit. And when I went to Zainul Abidin's house, his wife, Jahanara Abidin, who I was delighted to meet, said, but Ashish Anand came here and he wanted to buy everything, you know. What should I do? And this is over mangoes and lychee and all that. And I said, don't sell. Many artists do not have the institutional framing that Abidin, despite all kind of marginalization, has. He's the Bangladeshi artist, right? So if Abidin's papers, his diaries, his suitcase of photographs, which I want to see, are being on the verge of being sold, I do not know what will happen to other less significant artists. Artists in Calcutta have told me even their, in diaries where they write list of grocery, even those diaries have been sold. Now, it's a double-edged thing. It also allows people like me in Delhi to see these material. Of course, I would say that. But it's a double-edged sword. So the kind of interest, I mean, yeah, one would like access and one would like, but it could go both ways. And East Pakistan, Bangladesh could be more susceptible to certain kinds of sweeping collections. And I wonder what is then available for, historians like me who work on artists, or want to work on artists anyway. So that would be something. So I'm bothered about, attention is good, but yeah. I don't know what to fight here, but thank you very much.
All right, Sarah.
Mine's maybe more of a comment about the document and the documentary, and I think it was raised actually by Holly's paper, but then thinking about the wonderful kind of archival fragments that Lotte and Sanjukta showed as well, that the process of exhibition being archive and then the archive of the exhibition and how the historian works with those documents and what we do with them. So it's a very sort of ill-formed comment, but I think it's something that we might tease out through the next 2 days, and I think it probably links to a comment that Saloni made earlier about how we are doing this research, and it's something I know we're going to speak about tomorrow, but it's interesting when those documents become the exhibition themselves.
Wonderful. Iftikhar, Devika, Diana.
So regarding the exhibition design of Nehru's it seemed very similar to the Family of Man in some ways, with these kind of flat panels, and there's a lot of there's lots of discussion. scholarship on the family of man, so that might be worth looking at. A second comment is regarding Sultan's career. So Sultan used to hang out with Sadiq Khan in Karachi, okay, in the 50s, and both of them were kind of seen as kind of outsider, like these brilliant, quirky outsiders who were full of potential. And Sadiq Khan actually starts gaining fame in 1955 onwards, but then during the 60s, he's living in Paris. He lives from 61 through 67, I believe. And in the later part of his career in Paris, he is having a lot of difficulty, finding places to show and financial difficulties and so on. But he writes about, the only way to know about them is because he writes those as in the form of letters to his family. But in Pakistan itself, his fame is growing. The Pakistani artist who made it big in the West, etc. So there's a big gap between the perception of him within Pakistan and the difficulties of his, for him finding places to show his gallery shuts down. And so paradoxically, during the early part of his career in Paris is better for him than the later part. Okay. So the gap might actually work to the advantage. The people who are abroad, even though they may be having a miserable life, living and showing, they might actually contribute to their, their mystique within the nation. So maybe another thing to consider.
Devika, Diana, I see Sonia's hand. Let's see where we are on time. Devika. Oh, sorry. Yes, that's right. Devika here, then Diana.
It connects to Iftikhar Dadi's first comment and to your response, Willie. I actually thought that the two exhibitions worked very well as a comparison, but perhaps some of the implicit themes needed to be fleshed out a little bit. At a very anecdotal and empirical level, there's one connector which you didn't broach about, which is the presence of Sunil Khilnani in the bottom right-hand corner in one of the photographs that is displayed here. He's the man who's picking up books from the bookshelves.
She said it.
You mentioned
Yes,
it? Oh,
yes.
I missed it.
Yes.
So that I think is at a biographical level, and then Gita brought back in Dayanita's biography, and of course the fact that she studied at NID, and the connection also between furniture design and exhibition design. I think these are just things that need to be perhaps stronger, but I was actually convinced with the comparison. And sorry I missed that you mentioned Sunil Khilnani.
Diana.
Great. I want to also say thank you. I was really impressed by this research on Sultan. A lot of people in this room know I have been digging for just one piece of proof that he exhibited in London. There is no bibliography. There is nothing. I spent 2 months in Fukuoka trying to find the history behind his claimed solo exhibition in 1980. It never happened. But in Michigan, so my sister teaches at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, so she found the original letters of people that visited Sultan and their comments, student newspapers with pictures of him in the work. There's also a New York Times article that mentions him. But I mention this because IIEE, who gave him the grant to go to the US, would not confirm that he was there, would not help me, and it was finding this New York Times article that got them to open the file. So I'm sure that this image that you found can really help come up with more needed information.
Diana, will you pass it to Sonia behind you? Thank you.
I'll later. It's very different.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to use my position as chair to just make a very brief comment. But I opened my remarks I opened the panel by saying I was thinking about Shahid Amin's event, Matter for Memory. When I read the papers, and as I was hearing them, I was thinking of Wazir Zamindar's book, The Long Partition, and I was wondering how that model of history writing might be a useful analytic device to think about the art world during the 50s and 60s, and in particular, the kinds of themes of dispersal that you're seeing in the papers on Sultan and Aberdeen, and then the kind of what are it's centripetal and centrifugal, are those the two? But those two energies in and around the nation during this period that are in some ways strengthened by travel, and then, as Iftikhar has pointed out, also somewhat destabilized by travel. And then finally, one comment I thought of also as I was hearing the papers was that I loved Hamad's comment about, well, you know, how come the Sunday painter isn't a kind of model for thinking about art or travel and so on. And other ideas that aren't popular, really, about thinking art and the artist, but one is the idea of the artist as a bureaucrat that comes across, you know, and the conversations we've been having all day about cultural diplomacy made me think, oh yes, of course, the artist as, not quite statesman, but a kind of cultural worker and a kind of national cultural worker. And then I think Holly's paper on Nehru, with the passages from his writing, reinforced the idea that this was someone with who thought about history in an incredibly, that is to say Nehru himself, in an incredibly visual way. And so, you know, the references to the picture gallery and so on. So how might we think of the nationalist as an artist, which is another kind of question or problem opened up? I'm sorry? Hitler thought of himself. No, indeed, but you know, well, yes, well, I would say that there's more asymmetry there. I would like to insist there's more asymmetry there than commonality. But I think with that, we are out of time, so we are going to take a brief break before the next panel begins at 5:45. Thank you to all the speakers and to Nima.